Hi, everybody. I'm Clay Smith. I'm the literary director of the San Antonio Book Festival. Welcome to the first day of the festival. We're thrilled that you're here. So thank you also for purchasing Walter's new book, The Code Breaker. You may have been told this from Nowhere Bookshop, our festival bookseller, but it's going to be shipped to you soon if you don't already have an email from them about when it's going to arrive and with the tracking info. So look for that email next week if you don't already have that. Let me tell you a little bit about our guest today. Shraddha Chakradhar is a science journalist based outside of Boston. She's going to moderate and be in conversation with Walter today. She's currently a reporter at STAT, where she writes its flagship morning rounds and newsletter, as well as feature stories on everything from race and gender disparities in science to artificial intelligence in healthcare. Before joining STAT, she was a news editor for Nature Medicine and a researcher and a fact checker at Nova. And our guest of honor today, you already know him, but his name is Walter Isaacson, and he is a professor of history at Tulane, and he has been the CEO of the Aspen Institute, chair of CNN, and the editor of Time magazine. He is also the author of Leonardo da Vinci, The Innovators, Steve Jobs, Einstein, His Life and Universe, Benjamin Franklin, An American Life, and Kissinger, a Biography. And he is also the co-author of The Wise Men, Six Friends, and The World They Made. So if you look at the right-hand column of your screen, you will see a little box over there that says Q&A, and that's where you can place your questions. And we will try to get to as many of those questions as we can. Thanks again for being a part of this event. And I'm going to turn it over now to Shraddha and Walter.
Thank you, Clay. Thank you so much for having me. Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in. As Clay mentioned, my regular gig is as a reporter at STAT, so I'm used to asking questions for a living, but I'm not going to lie, speaking with Walter is intimidating. He's obviously much more experienced at asking questions, so we'll see how well I can do for the next little bit.
Hey, Shraddha, I read you every morning. You're the reason I get to ask questions. A lot of the morning we call from STAT.
That's very frustrating, and if anything, it puts even more pressure. But thank you so much for taking the time and for writing this book. You know, as Clay mentioned at the top of this session, you've written about a lot of other people: Da Vinci, Einstein, Steve Jobs, other technological innovators. Why the life sciences now? Why did you decide to pick this area now?
Well, the same reason you all decided to start STAT as a news service, because we're entering the century of the life sciences. I grew up during the digital revolution, you know, the last half of the 20th century. But this is a time in which molecules are going to be the new microchips, and people can both understand digital coding and the code of life, or they're truly creative and innovative people as we go into this. And I just wanted to understand it, especially when it comes to this altering technology for the species, which is simple and easy to use, reprogrammable gene editing, which means we can fix, you know, single gene mutations, help cure genetic diseases, but even eventually start designing babies. And that's where it becomes an issue for the humanists and the moralists and ethicists, as well as the scientists.
So let's get everybody on the same page before we go any further. What is CRISPR? Can you explain that to us? And now you're great understanding, I'm sure.
CRISPR is pretty simple because bacteria, and they're not much smarter than we are, have been using it for 1 billion years. It's simply a system they use to take a mugshot of any virus that attacks them, a little snippet of the genetic code of that virus. And then the bacteria puts that snippet into clustered repeated sequences that are known as CRISPRs. And so if the virus ever attacks again, then the bacteria can just use an enzyme and snip it up. That's a beautiful gimmick in nature to help bacteria. But now that we're being hit with wave after wave of virus epidemics, pretty useful to understand it. What Jennifer Doudna, the heroine of my book, did, along with Emmanuel Charpentier and a lot of other researchers, is figured out how to repurpose this tool that bacteria use and say, we can use it to cut our own DNA. All you have to do is reprogram that guide RNA that the bacteria uses and say, I want you to cut human DNA at this target. And thus, in 2012, they were able to show how CRISPR could be a tool to edit our human genes.
That's really, I have two questions. One is, as you mentioned, you're interested in the biological revolution now, but of all of the things, of all of the biological breakthroughs that we're seeing, what about gene editing and CRISPR specifically was interesting to you? And then I'll ask my next question.
Yeah, I think that gene editing is something that presents the most important human and moral and ethical issues. I mean, it's great. And in my book, I describe how we're using these type of molecules such as RNA to make our vaccines to fight coronavirus. And also Jennifer Doudna and her team are using CRISPR to do things like detection. So they can detect not only viruses, but bacteria and cancers in what will be a home detection test you'll have in your home. So all that's in the book. But the ability to edit our genes, I mean, we've been having evolution has been hanging around for 3 billion years. And now for the first time, a species, meaning us, our species, has been able to hack evolution and take control over its own future, its own genetic future. So that's it's like Prometheus snatching fire from the gods, or, Adam handing Eve the apple from the tree of knowledge. I mean, this is a game changer.
So I was really struck by your very simple but clearly thorough example or definition of what CRISPR is. Again, you haven't really written about the life sciences before, so can you talk to us a little bit of what kind of preparation you had to do to, get yourself familiar with this? And CRISPR, even for those of us who do write about the life sciences, is not an easy topic. So how did you prepare? How did you, go about learning about it, get your mind into writing about this challenging topic?
Well, when I grew up here in New Orleans, the motto of my school was Discimus Agere Agendo, which is Latin for we learn to do by doing. So during this reporting process, I spent time in Jennifer Doudna's lab, as well as those of her rivals like Feng Zhang and her colleague George Church, and went over to Berlin to spend time in the lab of Emmanuel Charpentier. But one of the things I asked is, show me how to use CRISPR. Show me how to edit genes. And so I spent time in the lab, and I think the little picture of me that they're using for this San Antonio Book Festival, people say, why do you have a black hand? Well, that's the latex glove I put on, and that's me during my experiments where I edit a bacteria cell, which is what Jennifer Doudna and others did in 2012. And then the next day, I begin work on editing a human cell. And so I really wanted to learn the technology and also see that it's pretty easy. Delivering it into human cells or into an embryo is hard, but actually doing the edits not that hard. And you're a journalist, that one of the secrets of journalism is if you knock on people's doors or you call them up, they like to talk. They like to talk about themselves. And so I've been a journalist for a long time, and I'm just very good at sort of saying, hey, I'm coming out to Berkeley or I'm coming up to MIT. Can I hang around you in your lab? And then I say, just let me tell the story. Tell me your story.
That's great. You just mentioned a host of characters that are in the book that you spent time with. So one of the things that struck me when I was reading the book is that the book is almost as much, if not more, about all of these people surrounding Doudna than it is about Doudna herself. And yet you opted for, the biography format. Obviously, it's Jennifer Doudna's face on the cover. So what about that format works for you? How did you, you talk very openly about how all of this is such a collaboration. So how did you still arrive at the biography format?
Well, everybody listening to this knows that collaboration is is part of the creativity that we have, that science is a team sport, creativity is a collaborative effort. And sometimes we biographers distort things by making it seem like a guy or a gal goes into a garage or a garret or a lab and has a light bulb moment and innovation happens. I wanted to show how it's all woven together, how people collaborate, how they compete, how they spur each other on, and they build on each other's experiments. But I also wanted to show how a central character can actually affect things, how each individual can, touch the surface of history and put out some ripples. And so it's both a group narrative about a dozen people or so who helped create CRISPR, gene editing, and now fighting COVID. But the central character is Jennifer Doudna. And I found it was useful to have a central narrative character, especially Jennifer Doudna, whose life story helps touch upon every element in this journey of adventure that I hope the reader gets to go on with me. I mean, even as a young girl, she's told, well, girls don't do science. So she persists at that. While the other men are pursuing the Human Genome Project in the 1990s, looking at DNA, she pursues RNA, which turns out to be the more interesting molecule. And then because of her knowledge of RNA, she's able to crack the code on how CRISPR is a gene editing tool. And then she's able to turn RNA into something that'll help us fight COVID. And she was the one who helped gather scientists from around the world with religious leaders and politicians to say, let's look at the moral challenges. So by following her, by going hand in hand with her, it gives a backbone to this narrative, and I'm able to weave in all the other characters.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, because the other thing is, and as you reveal in the book, Jennifer Doudna was sort of brought into the world of CRISPR, as we learned, right? Like, she hadn't heard of it when she got that call. So why, apart from, this fascinating backstory that she was focusing on RNA when others were focusing on DNA, the adversity she faced, the naysayers that she had to fend off. What about her contributions? I mean, why not SharpNTA? Why not Feng Zhang? What was it? Just the whole package? Was it something specifically about her scientific contributions? Sometimes.
Well, I met them all and spent time with them all, and I really admire and like Feng Zhang, for example. But he's young. This was his first outing. Jennifer wins the Nobel Prize. She's been, through a whole lot of these things. Likewise with Emmanuelle Charpentier, I went over to Berlin, spent time in her lab. She has been pretty narrowly focused on, microbiology, small organisms. And so after the initial 2012 discovery, she's a bit dropped out of the field of gene editing, even though she's still a wonderful person doing her work. So they all play this role in the book, but the narrative itself, which really has to start with DNA and RNA, bringing us into a new era. In 2000, when we sequenced the human genome, that notion of what DNA and RNA can do bursts into the world. And I wanted that narrative even to go back to 1953, when Watson and Crick discover the structure of DNA and the double helix. And Jennifer was in middle school when that book, The Double Helix, came out, and her dad left a paperback copy on her bed. And she read it, and she realized it was a detective story about how the structure of molecules are sometimes the key to unlocking what they can do in life. And she looks at the Rosalind Franklin character in that book and says, I get it. Women can be scientists. So her narrative really allows us to take the story from 1953, which is the structure of DNA, until about 3 or 4 months ago, when the book concludes, and she's come up with all these tools to fight the coronavirus, and she's just celebrated her win of the Nobel Prize.
Which brings me to another question I had, which is, this is such an evolving field. It's constantly changing, and it's a race to the top. How did you decide which science to cover? And did that intimidate you at all? That, there was constantly things that were going on with CRISPR that you couldn't, with book writing, your deadlines are a little longer, you have longer leads. So were you worried about any of that?
Well, what happened was I was about halfway through writing the book and 2/3 of the way I thought through researching it. That's when the coronavirus pandemic hit. And Jennifer had put her son on a train to go to Fresno, California, to be in a robot building competition. And she woke her husband up in the middle of the night, said, "We got to go retrieve Jamie. This pandemic is spreading." And, Jamie's an only child and was kind of rolling his eyes when his mom showed up at about 6 a.m. But then as they were leaving the parking lot, they got a text saying, robot competition canceled. Everybody go home. And it brought home to her that she was going to have to lead her team of scientists, 50 scientists in the Bay Area, to turn their attention to fighting COVID. Likewise, Fong Zhang at MIT turned the attention of him and his graduate students and the company he had formed to fighting COVID. So I said, okay, I'm going to delay writing this book. I'm now going to throw myself back into the reporting. I'm going to go to all the Zoom meetings and hang around in the Slack channels as they're fighting coronavirus. And so the continually updating nature of this science helped the book. I mean, I was willing to wait another year or so to write the book, and it got to make it seem as if we were going along in real time, because I was there in the Zoom rooms and Slack channels and watching the experiments be done on Google Docs. And so I hope it gives it as if it has a real-time flavor. But by the time that finished, we had the vaccines that were going to, I hope, beat back this pandemic. The Nobel Prize had been awarded to Jennifer and Emmanuel. The new updates of CRISPR I was able to put in the book, which is David Liu, who you know quite well because you've covered him at Harvard, who someday, along with George Church and Fong Zhang, I hope win a Nobel Prize themselves for medicine, because he had come up with base editing and prime editing, which are just sharper pencils and sharper scissors that you can use for the gene editing based on the concepts of CRISPR. And so all of that seemed to be a great culmination of a story that really begins in the 1950s, when we figure out the structure of DNA and the importance of RNA, both as a guide and as a messenger.
And part of the ever-changing nature of the story is the ongoing patent battles, right, between UC Berkeley and at the Broad Institute. So were you worried at all about wading into those really contentious waters, was that something that crossed your mind?
Well, they were very contentious, and it made me uncomfortable, because I know that science is a noble endeavor, but sometimes it gets distorted by the pursuit of patents, the pursuit of prizes, the pursuit of publication priority. You cover that all the time. That's the bread and butter for, stats journalism, is who gets priority, who gets patents, who gets prizes, who's made the discovery first. And we're all competitive. We journalists, you and me, we're competitive. We want that scoop. So I like competition. I loved covering it. But the patent battle just got a little too bitter, and it's still too bitter. I mean, it's vicious. They're trying to reveal, one side, there's some filings I just read, saying that these were not true, some other filings. And so I'm more of a peacemaker. I tried to get Fong Zhang and Jennifer Doudna, to all talk to each other and say, just like Bob Noyce of Intel did with Jack Kilby of Texas Instruments when they were fighting the patent battle over the microchip. They said, hey, let's quit fighting over divvying up the proceeds until we finish robbing the stagecoach. And they settled their patent battle. So I kind of wish they would. But one of the good things in the way the book concludes is when they're fighting COVID and they're all racing to make discoveries about how you can use Sherlock, which is this detector technology that Fong Zhang came up with, or use, Mammoth and the other technologies that Jennifer Doudna and her team came up with against COVID, they're putting them all up on servers, public domain, and saying, use these to help fight COVID. Here's our latest discovery. We're not asserting patent rights over it. I think it helped remind them, and I hope younger generations of students who read this book, that yeah, you want to get the patent, you want to get the prize, but you're doing it for a higher purpose.
Was that surprising to you that they were sort of able to put aside their patent battles to come together for this common cause? You know, having seen some of the patent battles and how vicious it had gotten when you saw that this was a development, how did that strike you?
Well, it pleased me, and I don't want to sugarcoat it too much. I mean, they put it all in the public domain for people who want to use to fight CRISPR, but they're also trying to patent it for long-term use. And there'll be these, for example, there'll be home detection kits that both Feng Zhang at the wonderful Broad Institute has put together, and Jennifer Doudna and her team at Mammoth Biosciences, which is the name of her company. And these home detection kits, which are already ready, they already exist, and they've just got conditional approval, and soon they'll be manufactured and you'll buy them at your Walgreens or CVS. It's like a home pregnancy test. Put a little saliva into a cartridge, put it into this device. And the great thing about it is that it won't just be for COVID. You know, you'll be able to use it if you have a bacterial infection, or if you want to see if a cancer tumor has resurfaced, or people will build apps on top of it. And maybe somebody will say, oh, I've built something to test your gut microbiome to see if you got the right bacteria in your gut. So this will help bring biology into our homes, into our living room, into our kitchens or bathrooms or wherever we put this device. And just like the personal computer helped bring the microchip into our lives, this will help bring programmable molecules into our lives. And even if we don't fully understand how do you program a molecule, at least we'll have a fingertip feel for it because we'll be using it every morning.
I have an audience question here related to this, which is Patricia asks, is it your sense that when COVID hit, this CRISPR technology was mature enough to address the virus almost right away?
No, CRISPR is not yet mature enough to do for us what it does for bacteria, which means it's in our system. We can't, we want to someday be able to have it in our system, and it will just kill a virus that comes along. If we program it right and say, here's a coronavirus, it'll just kill the virus. Instead, we're still doing vaccines, which are pretty good. But vaccines work by stimulating the immune system of our bodies, meaning the immune system, the T cells and the immune system in our body is what does the work to kill the virus infection. And yes, we're able to use messenger RNA, as everybody now knows, in both the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines. And that's part of this overall technology that Jennifer helped develop, because in these vaccines, RNA acts as the messenger, telling our cells which proteins to build. That's what messenger RNA does in the life sciences. And it says, build this fragment of the spike protein, and that gives us immunity. The promise of CRISPR that's pretty soon down the road, probably in a year or so, is something that Feng Zhang's group and Jennifer's group have done, which is say, just be an antiviral, just be put into our lung cells or whatever cells we're having problems with this virus and kill the virus directly. So that's going to be another arrow in our quiver in our fight against viruses in the long run.
I'm curious to know, since we're talking about the pandemic, how had you planned to end the book? Spoiler alert for those of you who haven't read the book yet, the very last section is all about the coronavirus, as we've sort of been talking about. So I'm curious to know, like, when you first conceptualized this book, it was pre-pandemic, I'm guessing. So what was the plan then?
Well, I kept hoping she'd win the Nobel Prize, and even though she slept through the phone call from one of your fellow reporters, I had my alarm set for 4 a.m. so I could watch the live stream from Stockholm And a year and a half ago when they did it, I thought, okay, and they didn't give the prize to CRISPR. But as you know, this October, I let out a cheer when I heard the Secretary of the Academy say, if we're rewriting the code of life and bringing science into a new era, I knew then that it was going to be for CRISPR. I was writing this book, and sometimes you write a book and say, I did it with Steve Jobs. It's like, we'll find out how the movie ends, but we're on a journey of discovery. And I postponed ending the book because the pandemic came along, and fortunately, the Nobel Prize and other things came along as well. Also, you haven't mentioned it yet, but while I was doing the book, another incredibly major event happened that, caused me to keep delaying it, which is in China, a doctor who had been to Jennifer Doudna's seminars created the first designer babies, edited early stage embryos of what turned out to be two twin girls to edit out the receptor for HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. And that was a huge headline. And certainly Stat was in the forefront of covering it. The late, great Sharon Begley was somebody who, a great reporter on that story. And when that happened, I went, okay, that's another major milestone that'll be part of this book.
Yeah, I was just gonna bring up both the HIV, the twin babies' birth, and also the Nobel Prize. Whether you had anticipated the Nobel Prize, sounds like you did. I was also up at 4 a.m. last October, so I distinctly remember that announcement. And so it sounds like you were sort of waiting for the announcement to be included in your book.
Well, I actually considered hacking into the election system of the Swedish Academy, but that turned out to not be possible.
Yeah, that would have made for another sweet story, I'm sure. And so can you talk to us, you've sort of described a little bit, but can you talk to us how finishing the book changed during the pandemic? It sounds like you describe all of these scenes, you said you went to Berkeley and Berlin and, came up here to Boston. So a lot of that had to change, I'm sure. So beyond like Zoom meetings, like was there, what else changed as far as, well, you don't have the same kind of access anymore?
Well, in real time, I could be following what was happening in 2 or 3 different labs. In other words, I always had the Slack channels open, and there were maybe 20 Slack channels in the group that Jennifer Doudna had gathered in the Bay Area, doing different things, detection technology, the antivirals that I talked about, likewise with Fong Zhang, or being at the Zoom meetings. And as a reporter, that's a whole new thing. I'd never had that happen before, where I was in real time. Instead of saying, explain to me how you made this discovery, or explain to me the experiments that didn't work, I'm sitting there looking at the data of the experiments that didn't work, or the ones that did work, the aha moments. And so I hope I can make it feel like a real-time drama as we go through these things at the end of the book. But a larger question happened, which is how did it change our thinking in some ways? Right behind me, you can see those doors, and they open up into a balcony. I'm here in the French Quarter, and they overlook Royal Street. And the epilogue of my book is about sitting on the balcony behind me. And before the pandemic, I had all these worries about, will CRISPR technology edit out the diversity of our species? I could sit on that balcony on a good day and see people, tall and short and fat and skinny and white and black and brown and all different hues of beautiful diversity, and straight and gay and trans and people using sign language from Gallaudet University. And you think, okay, that diversity is such a wonderful part of our species, and it helps our species be resilient. But if we all get to edit the traits we want for our kids, will we edit out deafness? Will we edit out manic depressiveness? Will we edit out many things? Will we edit, height or hair color or sexual orientation, meaning individuals? Will they do that? I worried about that. Well, I'm still worried about that, but the pandemic also made me worry. I saw how horrible it can be when our species gets hit in a way that we're defenseless. And so the notion of doing gene editing to make us less susceptible to viruses, I became more open to that. And I was writing the book. I got a lot of emails. Now I get maybe 20 a day. It's heartbreaking. I can pick up my phone here and just show you some from today in which people say, I want to show you a picture of my 12-year-old granddaughter. She's got this, and they'll describe a rare and they say she's going to die in 3 years. Or here's a picture of my 9-year-old son, and he's got muscular dystrophy, and I know it's a genetic, and now he's degenerating. Can you get me in touch with Jennifer Doudna? And so my thinking about worrying about how this technology will be misused, it changed a bit. And I began to think, all right, we're very lucky we have this technology. Let's use it wisely, because there's a lot of suffering that happens out there. And, we can fix that because of gene editing.
Yeah, which brings me to another audience question, which is what kinds of controls or limits need to be put into place to control this? It seems that gene editing is definitely, obviously it's already happening, but what, right now we're kind of at a yellow light. You use this traffic light description in the book. So what would need to happen for it to become, more green?
In the book, I go step by step because I think it's a slope and the slippery slope, and all slopes are slippery. So it's better to navigate them step by step, hand in hand, and say, all right, let's look at potential cases. And I do it with real life examples, and I do it with the reader, trying to almost like we're jointly formulating when we take this step. And the easiest steps, the ones that have already been taken and I think should be taken, are fighting and reversing single gene mutation genetic disorders. Sickle cell. This past year, a woman is cured of sickle cell with a CRISPR gene editing fix. Likewise, we're going to be able to do congenital blindness. Cancer at the University of Pennsylvania and in Philadelphia is being done. And in China is being done. So those single gene mutations, and there are about 7,000 of them, but some common ones like cystic fibrosis, muscular dystrophy, Huntington's, Tay-Sachs, those are easy. Do it in the human body. The patient consents, you do it. Then there are ones that are harder, that involve multiple genes. And that includes things like height and hair color and a propensity and dispensation or disposition to be a schizophrenic, let's say. We don't understand all that yet, so let's go real slow there. Then there's what, you and I in the science world call the germ line, which is not just an edits in a patient, but edits that will be inherited or in all the cells and reproductive cells of like the Chinese girls, whose children and descendants will all have that edit. I don't think we need to be doing that one yet. And finally, there are the enhancements. Let's make our kids have higher IQs or be taller or stronger. And we don't want the rich to buy better genes for their kids. That'll take the inequalities in our society and not only exacerbate them, but encode them, the way you have in Brave New World or Gattaca. So there's no simple answer, but I do have a process in the book where I hope we can all think through, because we, you and me and all of us, have to be part of a discussion about how do we use this technology.
Yeah, can you speak a little bit more to the economics of it? There's already a lot of cultural selection, if you will, that happens, parents, picking the best colleges, best schools, best summer camps, whatever. So what's to prevent this, more accessible gene editing exacerbating, as you said, these divides? How would we ensure economically more equitable access to gene editing?
Well, in the book, Jennifer gathers groups of people working now, to make things more affordable. The sickle cell treatment I told you about costs about $1 million. That's because you have to take the stem cells out in the bone marrow, retransmit plant. And so she's looking for ways, well, maybe we can do it in the body. And of course, the cheapest way to do it is do it in reproductive cells, so you don't have to edit each new patient. And so maybe that'll cause us to cross that line of making heritable edits, because that way it'll be more equitably distributed. But I think we're going to have some regulations and control. We don't want it to just be a free market, free for all. And just like with organ donations, we don't allow organs to go to the highest bidder. And just like drugs, we have international accords that decide which type of drugs are approved. And some countries do it somewhat differently, as we've seen with the COVID vaccines. But in this case, Jennifer and others are gathering the regulators from around the world, saying, let's see if we can figure out a common way to regulate this.
I'm curious to know, what were your thoughts on gene editing prior to starting work on this book, and how have they changed? You sort of describe a mini evolution in Jennifer Doudna's way of thinking about it. So I'm curious to know, personally, did you come into it with misconceptions that were corrected, or how did that go?
I think I came into it like most people would, with the first reaction, which is to flinch a bit, saying, aren't we snatching fire from the gods here? And maybe we shouldn't be editing our genes. And then, like a lot of people, I started thinking, well, which cases would we use it? Which cases we wouldn't? I said, it's a little bit more complex. And as I said, the coronavirus coming along made me realize that all creatures, large and small on this planet, use every trick in their playbook to figure out, how am I going to thrive? How am I going to make sure my children survive? And it's natural. That is probably the definition of the most natural thing, is trying to ensure the survival of your species. And therefore, I became more open to us, just like bacteria do it, just like, every other organism does it, to say, what can we do to make ourselves healthier and make ourselves thrive? But I also wrote the book so we can have the moral discussion of, yes, we should be using this, but here's some lines we should draw.
And what was the most surprising thing you learned during the process of reporting this book? Was there something you're like, wow?
Well, one surprising thing was how easy it was to do CRISPR edits. So I think we're going to all have to think this through. Also, it was surprising to me how beautiful nature is. And that if you're going on a journey of discovery, like I do in this book, you begin with a basic curiosity about the simplest and most fundamental things in nature. And that's how science begins. Jennifer Doudna did not set out to create a gene editing tool. The saga begins with a graduate student in Spain, in the late 1990s, trying to sequence these weird, organisms from odd environments, like bacteria from salt ponds, and saying, I keep seeing these repeated sequences. And he thought he had screwed up the sequencing because, he was just a graduate. But soon he realizes, and he's the one who gives them the name CRISPRs, and just out of basic curiosity, he does it. And Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier and Chilean Banfield, all these people are just looking at it for curiosity's sake. But so too are a couple of scientists at a yogurt company, Danisco, because they want to help protect the bacteria in their yogurt cultures. And they look at the history of the sequences of bacteria cultures that Danisco has used. And they realize, every time there's a wave of viruses, we get new CRISPR segments. And so sometimes the beauty of pure curiosity leads to something that's useful, a technology that's a tool. Just like Einstein's basic curiosity about space and time and motion leads to an E=mc² and leads to GPS and space travel and atom bombs. So I think I was just surprised about how important it is to be passionately and playfully curious about the basic beauties of nature.
I think one of the things that you did really well in this book, and it's a technique that I'm still playing with in my own writing, is to insert yourself and to show your natural curiosity. And so I was wondering why you made that deliberate choice. Are you sort of putting yourself in the shoes of every reader who's discovering, these things as you are? You described the scene where you try your hand at gene editing, but there are also like perspectives and your own thoughts that you insert throughout the book. So what about that technique?
Yeah, I want this to feel like we're all going hand in hand. Me, the reader, you, Jennifer, Fengjiang, on a journey of discovery. And I'm part of that journey. When I was very young and I was starting out as a journalist, you're asking sort of a process question, it was right here in New Orleans. I worked for the Times-Picayune. And we learned never, ever put yourself in the story. So a story would happen, and the story would happen that somehow, because I was there, or it had some connection to it, whatever, and you'd not put yourself in. You'd say one observer said, or one person, or, a onlooker noticed that, and you're really talking about yourself. Well, that was kind of weirdly awkward. And I used that when I was at Time magazine. I kept myself out of it. But every now and then I'd write a story in which, just by riding along with the subject of the story, whether it was Bill Gates or Madeleine Albright, I was in the meetings and doing things. And so occasionally, if it was less awkward, I would say, we got into the car and this happened and I saw, or whatever. Then with Steve Jobs, I really did become part of the story. I was, living in his guest house. I was with him in the last years of his life. And as I was with him, somehow I was a minor participant in the narrative, doing things where you can read the book. I mean, and it would have been almost disingenuous to have tried to report it without mentioning or saying it in the natural way, which is, using the first person occasionally. I try to use it sparingly, but if I'm talking about how I learned to edit, I don't want to keep saying one writer learned to edit or one reporter learned to edit. And I think it becomes a more conversational, intimate book when I'm talking directly to the reader and feeling like we're doing this journey together.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. We only have a couple minutes left, so I want to quickly ask, so given the vicious nature of the patent battles, do you ever envision CRISPR going the way of, say, Jonas Salk's polio vaccine, where it was sort of, almost like a free-for-all, given its promise, especially with the pandemic? Do you ever see it going that way?
Not really. I mean, I think actually patents and intellectual property play an important role in science. And BioNTech, by having created their version of mRNA, and Moderna, and for that matter, Johnson & Johnson and others, I think people have a right to get a return when they put $1 billion of research and development into something and it works. But I also think it's important that they not exploit patents. We have a pretty complex system of when an academic institution like Berkeley comes up with an idea using federal funding. There's a Bayh-Dole Act that explains how it's all allocated. And I think that system is pretty good, although I think the patent battle got out of hand when it came to CRISPR. And I think it's been restored now in the case of COVID, which is people aren't asserting patent rights in the coronavirus field in a way that inhibits our ability to fight the disease.
And last question. So who's next? Who's going to be your next subject, assuming you're going to stick with the biography format? We are at a book festival, so that would be a great time.
I really don't know. I mean, I love people who put themselves into many realms, like a Bill Gates. I love characters from history. I love Louis Armstrong, who invented jazz in the neighborhood in which I'm now sitting. So I'm kicking around a lot of things. But the people I write about share many traits. One is a basic curiosity. The other is that their curiosity spans all fields, like Leonardo da Vinci or Ben Franklin. They care about anatomy as well as art, and biology as well as music, as well as math, as well as zoology. And that's true of a humanist like Jennifer Doudna. It's true of Steve Jobs, who had a foot in both camps. And so I always look for people whose creativity comes from seeing the patterns that ripple across nature and who are interested in a wide variety of fields. Leonardo da Vinci being the ultimate in that, but even a Jennifer Doudna, who loves the French language, loves music, loves art, cares about the humanities and morality, but also happens to be a biologist and a chemist. Those are the people I like to write about.
Okay, well, we'll keep guessing and maybe making lists of people who fit all those bills. But thank
People
you.
can send me messages and say, here's who you have to do next.
Yeah, maybe I will. Well, thank you so much, Walter, for taking the time. This was really fascinating. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And please do check out all the other festival events as well. Thank you. Take care.
And thank you. Bye-bye.